It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this, our last public lecture of the fall quarter. And it's great to see such a large audience because it is indeed a very important lecture with two very distinguished and important speakers. My name is Richard Madsen. I'm a research professor at the University here of UC San Diego, and I'm the director of the Fudan Center, Fudan UC Center for the study of contemporary China. Today's speakers, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce. First of all, Professor Wu Xinbo, one of the most distinguished professors of international affairs in China. He's dean of the Institute of International Studies and director of the Center for American Studies at Fudan University in Shanghai. He's an expert on China-U.S. relations, China's foreign policy, and the United States Asia-Pacific strategy. He also serves on a policy advisory board of the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's the author of many important books. Give a taste of what his work is like. Some of his latest books are Managing Crisis and Sustaining Peace Between China and the United States, and the New Landscape in Sino-U.S. Relations in Early 21st Century China. Our second speaker is Professor Susan Shert, who really needs no introduction. I'm sure you all know her. She was a founding director and longtime director of the 21st Century China Center here at the UC San Diego, and has both published many books and articles and been involved as a deputy director of Secretary of State in our national government. She's one of the most influential figures in formulating policy, these frameworks for policy in U.S. China relations. Her most recent book, Overreach: How China Derailed Its Peaceful Rise, and her earlier book, China, Fragile Superpower, helped frame the policy debates on China in the United States and in other countries. So the topic, of course, today is on the future of U.S.-China relations in the incoming Trump administration. The format will be that Wu Xinbo and Susan will start out with some opening remarks, followed by a few rounds of questions from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. For our hybrid audience, by the way, should note that this will be recorded and later posted on YouTube, other platforms. People who are online can ask questions using the question and answer app on the platform. And Harry, our managing assistant, will collate the questions and ask them. In the meantime, of course, you all are free to ask questions during the question and answer period. The only housekeeping issue I'd like to raise, though, is that we're in a tight time schedule because this room has to be vacated for a class. We have to be finished. So we'll have to end pretty promptly by 4:40. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Wu and Susan and begin the conversation.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. This event is organized by the Fudan UC Center on Contemporary China, which is really a great asset to UC San Diego and the School of Global Policy and Strategy. And we feel very flattered that Fudan University decided to put this first Overseas Studies Center as part of UC and to base it here at the School of Global Policy and Strategy. And it's really a great pleasure that Professor Wu was able to come over across the pond to join all of us in this discussion. He's going to go briefly to Washington, but it's a very quick trip. And very important that we maintain good communication and the longtime friendship that we've had with so many of our Chinese counterparts during these difficult days in U.S. China relations. So I'll get us started by saying that it may surprise you to hear me say that I think that the new Trump administration could be a moment of opportunity for U.S. China relations. And that's what I would say to the president-elect if he asked for my advice. And why do I say that? Because right now, the United States has some significant leverage that it could use to induce China, encourage China to moderate its policies and actions through negotiations. And we have a president who believes in negotiating deals. So you put those things together and it's a moment of opportunity. But the Trump administration has to take care not to squander this opportunity to negotiate a deal, because there's really only a very narrow path to a deal consistent with our goals. And if we miss it, the outcome could be an unmanaged decoupling with the very real risk of escalation, which neither side wants. The starting point for the United States and the new administration is relatively favorable due to the serious internal difficulties within the PRC right now. Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders are worried about the loss of confidence and potential dissatisfaction and instability they face due to their domestic economic problems. And some of these economic problems are structural, such as the demographic problem, population problem, but some of them are self-inflicted by policy mistakes. Local governments are broke. Local government debt, according to our colleague Victor Scher, is 125% of revenues. The official media, Chinese official media, openly is talking about the problems of local governments kidnapping businessmen from other provinces and forcing them to pay into the government revenues because they're so broke. And I find it really rather shocking, not just that these things occur, but that the party and government press are talking so openly about them. Approximately 20% of recent college graduates are unemployed. Foreign direct investment in China has cratered due to loss of confidence. And I think China's leader himself is quite nervous about potential dissatisfaction and potential social instability during his third term. And so it's a very tough time in China. There's a lot to keep Xi Jinping awake at night. China's also in the middle of a anti-corruption campaign and purge that's been going on for more than a decade. And just recently, in the last week, we've heard about very senior military officers in the Central Military Commission who have been fired or are under investigation. And these are people that the leader himself had selected and worked with for some time. So he has a lot to worry about at the elite level too, about the possibility of resistance, not just from the society, but from other leaders who as well. So he really needs to show that he can handle foreign policy relations with the United States effectively. Meanwhile, the United States, I would say, is in a relatively strong position. Trump won a strong mandate from the voters, and he inherits a robust economy and strong security alliances in Asia and Europe. The Americans could also put on the bargaining table, the negotiating table, the threat of tariffs and technology restrictions in the future, as well as the ones that have already been imposed. So we can use this leverage, including the threat of tariffs, to negotiate a deal with China. Chinese officials have hinted to some of my colleagues who've been traveling to China recently. I haven't been there for about 6 months, but people in China are talking, indicating that they are open to a deal in order to get some breathing room to deal with domestic problems. And they're preparing an offer that probably includes some of the same things Japan did when we had problems of too many Japanese exports back in the 1980s. So probably includes export restraints, some domestic structural reforms to stimulate consumption, as well as purchases of American exports. China just last week cut export tax rebates to aluminum, copper, refined oil, and battery products. As it appears to me, that's a kind of signal that they're open to taking that kind of action, or that they at least recognize that overcapacity is a problem. It's creating negative effects for other economies. Part of the deal could be to allow Chinese companies to set up manufacturing in the United States, including electric vehicles and battery plants. The president-elect has already talked about that during the campaign. You know, I think there's a lot of elements that could be part of a negotiated deal with China. Xi Jinping's message to President-elect Trump was very conciliatory. He said, you know, talked about both countries stand to gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation. So, but at the same time that they're making these conciliatory gestures, China is for sure preparing for a trade war with the United States. Because if President Trump doesn't take my advice and instead starts off by, in one fell swoop, imposing tariffs on China. China this time will be prepared with a toolkit of much stronger retaliatory measures, not nearly as moderate as those it used in the 2018-19 trade war, because they believe that their approach last time just led to more escalation. It didn't lead to a stalemate and a resolution of the differences. There's also, of course, possibilities of currency depreciation and continuing to diversify the final assembly of Chinese products to third countries, that the United States can't attack all of them at once. And they also anticipate that if Trump does impose draconian tariffs on China, that it'll lead to inflation, which will erode the support for the tariffs in the United States and rally third countries to China's side. So the early moves are really crucial. If the Trump administration starts off by just whacking China with the tariffs and with very hostile rhetoric, this will be interpreted as a humiliation for Xi Jinping, and it will foreclose the possibility of a negotiated deal. And also, if Beijing believes that the Trump administration's goal is not a negotiated outcome, but actually to topple Chinese Communist Party rule in China, and there are certainly people in the Trump orbit who believe that, it will certainly complicate any effort to get a deal. So that would be the other thing I would say to the president-elect. Don't get off on the wrong foot with Beijing. Don't start off with overly hostile moves. Plan for an early leader-to-leader meeting. And these summit meetings will be particularly important in the Trump administration. And recall, in the first Trump administration, President Trump, made quite good use of leader-to-leader meetings. And my hope and expectation is that if we start off with a negotiation focused on the economy, on trade and investment, then ultimately it could gradually lead to negotiations or even negotiations on geopolitical issues, including Ukraine, Middle East, Taiwan. I won't take the time to talk any more about that, but I do believe that if we're able to find common ground on economic issues, it would create a more favorable basis to reduce the risks of military conflict in the Indo-Pacific. So, and given President-elect Trump's style, his transactional approach, I don't think this is an overly optimistic idea. I think it's entirely possible. However, he is surrounded by a lot of other figures who are security hawks or economic security hawks. But ultimately, it really comes down to his decision. And I hope that he'll take my advice and take the path toward negotiation. So what's your advice to President Xi?
Let me figure out. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank Dick for your kind introduction and thank the 21st Century Center for its invitation. Over the years, in spite of the ups and downs in bilateral relations between our two countries, Sudan USSD friendship has only deepened and expanded. I think we both benefited from this relationship, and I want to do my best to contribute to this strong ties between our two institutions. I arrived yesterday, so now it's late in the afternoon, so I don't think I can control every word I would say next. So do not use them. Do not use what I said as the evidence against me in court. The Trump return in China was met with much less surprise than 8 years ago. It was somehow anticipated. But the challenge for American watchers in China is how to explain this phenomenon. In the past 80 years, we have been trying to figure out whether the Trump phenomenon is an episode or is an inevitable trend that will reshape the US. Now, with this election result, it seems Trump phenomenon is not an episode, but a prevailing trend that may reshape the US politically, socially, and economically in many years to come. Why this happened? So people keep asking this question, I try to answer this question in the context of my 30 years study of the United States. This year, I joked to my students that there are two important things in American studies. One is the US election and Trump will win the election. The second is this year marks the 30th anniversary of my first visit to the United States. So my first visit to the United States was in 1994. And I recall these 3 decades of my engagement with the United States. I visit the US every year, with the exception of the COVID, only 2 years, 2020 and 2021. And for the rest of 28 years, every year I come to this country and even stayed there for an extended period of time, several times. So I think I saw 3 different America in the last 3 decades. In the 1990s, I saw a very confident and optimistic America. With the end of Cold War, the US stood as the only remaining superpower and advocating for engagement and enlargement in the world, promoting globalization, providing public goods, and reviving multilateral institutions. So that was the United States I saw in the 1990s. In the next decade, I saw a different America after September 11th, 2 wars and 1 crisis. I saw a frustrated and angry America. Why all of a sudden, the wind just changed its direction for the United States. What went wrong? I think this kind of mood brought Obama the first black president into the White House. So that was a strong mood I could feel in the United States. The third decade, from Obama to Trump's fourth administration, I saw a divided and antagonistic America. Obama's presidency somehow made Trump's ascendance almost inevitable to some extent. So political polarization, social division, clash of values and ideas. We just see, America become very much different from what it looked like in 1990s. So I try to explain, Trump's return in that broad historical context. So in that sense, it was not Trump who introduced these kind of changes to the US, but the changes we saw in the previous decade and the current decade brought Trump into the White House and again twice. So that is how I try to understand the changes taking place in the United States. And down the road, we may witness a period that Republicans may govern this country for another 12 years. So it's not just Trump for 4 years, could be another 80 years after Trump's second term. So that will be a very different America, politically, socially, and economically. Whether or not this will be the case, wait and see. But I think the US is indeed in a major transformation, which poses a challenge for American watchers like us who are familiar with the usual liberal internationalist paradigm in understanding the US since the end of World War II. So that is quite an intellectual challenge. Now, let me make some brief remarks on China-US relations. I agree, but like to understand what Susan already said, it's difficult to speak after Susan on China-US relations. I think what China is trying to tell is what Trump really wants in his second term when it comes to China, deal or no deal. Okay, in his fourth term, he made it very clear to President Xi that he wanted to cut a deal so that he could use it as something he can brag to the audience to get re-elected. That's for sure. And he got the fourth phase agreement. In his second term, he may still need to make a deal with China so that to address his concerns in trade, manufacturing industry, finance, and also other security issues. So that's the one possibility. A deal is preferred. But there could be another dynamics that will drive his China policy towards so-called strategic decoupling, as Susan just mentioned. So for some people in his team, no deal with China is the best outcome. So strategic decoupling is preferred. So in that case, there will be a very different outcome coming out of his second term in relation with China. So I think China is still trying to figure out what's his real intention. What I would recommend for our leaders is that we need to reach out to his team and ideally to Trump himself as early as possible and establish a reliable channel of communication, formal or informal, so that we can better understand have a better understanding of his intention. And secondly, once the channel of communication is established, we need to sit down to talk about what are each other's concerns and expectations. Let's compare the notes and to say how we can, reconcile with each other. And after that, we should be prepared for a very tough negotiation process with a lot of bargaining pressure, compromise, and trade-off. That is something, for the positive side. On the negative side, I think China should also prepare for a situation in which deal cannot be made, and a trade war, another round of trade war will be inevitable. And in that case, I think China will fight the trade war very differently from it did during Trump's fourth term. And we have more, I believe we have more ammunition than we do during Trump's fourth term, and we would be resolved to use them as necessary. So we need to send this signal to Trump team very clearly. And finally, China-US relations have never been a bilateral undertaking. So we have to think about how to reach out the third parties if we, have to face some uphill battle dealing with Trump in his second term. And in that regard, I think we have a lot of potential partners. I mean, European Union is one example. With Trump pushing more pressure on European Union on economic issue and trying to, approach Putin on the security front, Europe will seek to improve relations with China because China remains as a major economic partner to Europe. And also, as Trump becomes less enthusiastic about dealing with transnational issues like climate change or fixing WTO, the multilateral institutions, China remains a reliable partner to Europe. So in that case, we may face more pressure from the US side bilaterally, but we have other opportunities in dealing with other parties, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Europe, Latin America. So they are both, challenges and opportunities. Finally, how if a situation, let me put it this way, for the second Trump administration, I think the challenge for China for both sides is not to, improve the relationship or to expand cooperation, which I think is unrealistic, but rather how to do damage control and navigate the next 4 years, which will be doomed to be turbulent and very dangerous. So even though I wear a red tie, so I also have the lady in red, but that doesn't mean we are optimistic about China-US relations in the next 4 years. We just want to, make the late afternoon more rosy. Okay. So with that, I stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you both. And this is very stimulating and you really did touch on, I think, the major issues and the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns which you have to deal with. I think my take is that there's a wide spectrum of possibilities, including more optimistic ones, including some very negative ones. And given Trump's, mercurial personality, to say the least, and the complexity of his supporters and his base, it could swing in different ways, so it's very difficult to know. So maybe the only question I have is, what can be done through our universities like this, educational exchange, to keep the worst things from happening and maybe tilt more toward the best things, okay? Educational exchanges, the problem partly is, if we would reach out to China, we're part of the educated elites, who are now out of favor. And there's pushback there. And in China, in its own way, there's pushback on these kind of things. So what is constructive things that we could do to, if anything, to influence the outcomes, generally better way for both sides?
Very good question. I think there are a lot of to say about the importance of people to people exchanges. My center, the Center for American Studies at Fudan University, was created by a group of Fudan professors who studied in the U.S. in the 1940s. Madame Xie, who received her PhD from MIT, and also my PhD mentor, Professor Wang Xi, graduated from Wharton School, UPenn in 1940s. So in early 1980s, when China opened up to the US, that was, I think it was after President Reagan visited Fudan University and delivered a speech in 1984. Madame Xie and Professor Wang Xi, they realized that, their generation are getting old. They need to cultivate young generation of American workers who can better understand the US. So that's how, we had the American Center, and over the last several decades, we have cultivated hundreds of, young Chinese American workers. And now they are dealing with America, either working in different government agencies or in the media, in the company business community. They are playing an important role in this regard. In a time of difficult official relations, I think the university exchanges can play a positive role in two senses, on two fronts. One is that we can still, enhance better mutual understanding, reduce the misperception and misjudgment of the other side. Second is that we can continue to cultivate the talented people who can do, good policy analysis. So when the right political atmosphere comes up, they can provide good recommendations to the governments about how to advance this relationship. So I think, no matter how difficult the official relationship may be, we just need to maintain the university to university bonds. It's a very important investment into the future.
I couldn't say it any better. I agree with everything you said, and I guess I just will note that in the last year or so, I've met a number of presidents of Chinese universities who are absolutely determined to sustain these kinds of cooperative relationships. And despite the obstacles and suspicions, so, you know, there's motivation on both sides.
So I'll open it now for questions. One that Harry, do you have questions for me?
Yeah, I've got a question from online. So both speakers mentioned that a trade war in Trump's second term would look different than the first term, and that China has more ammunition now than before and would use it. What ammunition does China have now that it didn't have previously? And what would a likely response from China look like if Trump implements quick tariffs or other measures against China?
Well, you know, despite the tech restrictions that have been and controls on data and things like that that have been imposed by both sides, and the kind of the drive for more tech self-reliance on both sides. These ecosystems are still so incredibly integrated. And so American tech companies in particular, and not just them, but particularly them, are very vulnerable to retaliation from the Chinese side. So, and there was a story in the newspaper a few days ago about the leading American drone manufacturer that they use batteries in China. If they don't have the batteries, these drones won't stay up very long. So, so export embargoes, bans on the exports of these companies, of the products to the other side can be extremely damaging. So these businesses can be severely hurt.
And we can also further reduce the U.S. bonds. And we can also work with other BRICS countries to facilitate non-US dollar-based payment system and make more bilateral arrangements with other trading partners for non-US dollar-based trade. I mean, China is the largest trading state for commodities in the world. I think we have quite a few ammunitions in this regard. Yeah.
And China's been studying the how Russia has managed to evade sanctions, financial sanctions. In fact, their Wall Street Journal article today said that there is a special committee in China to study this, and they go to Russia and interview all the people of the banks and whatever to learn how to evade the sanctions based on what the Russians are doing to evade US sanctions.
Forgive the obvious simple question. What is likely to be the attitude by the leader in the government with regard to South China Sea and Taiwan in the coming years?
Which leader, which government?
You're talking about.
Speaking of the Chinese government, of course,
Okay.
we have no idea what about the
Well,
American
that's a very broad question. You don't have to deal with the whole thing.
government.
Pick one.
Well, I don't worry that much about South China Sea issue. I mean, that's not a big deal. Even though, you say the tension, but I don't think a major war will occur in South China Sea. So don't worry. I don't worry about Taiwan issue. Not because Trump himself pays a lot of attention to Taiwan, no. But because, some of the either ideological hawks or geopolitical hawks in his team they may want to push the envelope on the Taiwan issue. And then that may force our leaders to respond in a very powerful way to show that we are able to keep the situation in the Taiwan Strait under control. So that's my concern.
Thank you both. This was really terrific, really so informative. I'm less optimistic than Susan is about what's coming in the next several years. So I agree that I think this is
Can't
more
hear
than a
you.
4-year change. But related to the first online question, picking up on and adding to Susan's point, I think the other thing that we're not thinking about in terms of the kind of retaliatory approaches China may take is on the incoming market. That is, there are many technology companies as well as other companies who are very dependent upon sales in China. And I, for one, have been very surprised, or was surprised for years, that China didn't take retaliatory steps when we, for example, did all the export controls. And of course, Biden's now done even more just the other day. So I suspect that Trump will, in fact, act very quickly to impose things like tariffs. The question I have is whether Xi Jinping is likely to react immediately, because there will be consequences in the U.S. to a tariff war that will happen fairly quickly. I think people will react to the prices that they will have to pay. And so is Xi Jinping going to wait it out a little bit? Is he going to maintain that that reluctance to take hard retaliatory steps, or is he likely to take these retaliatory steps very quickly?
Hard to predict, but I guess it depends on the scale of the tariff that Trump may impose on China. I mean, if he just, jump to 60%, all the imports from China, I mean, we have no choice, right? So we have to retaliate immediately and also strongly. If this is just, what he said, 10% toward China, 25% toward Canada and Mexico, okay, that is more a signal than a substantive matter. So we can sit down to negotiate how to address his concern. I mean, for this particular argument, 10%, because he said, China was not so forthcoming in dealing with the fentanyl issue, which is, of course is wrong, but that means his concern is really not on the economic side, but on the drug issue. So we have to, to tell, what specifically, what kind of action he would take, what's the scale of the tariff, what's with his purpose on that.
Thank you. During the APEC meeting, President Xi Jinping and President Biden had a meeting, and President Xi Jinping outlined the 4 red lines. It's Taiwan, and democracy and human rights, and China's president system, and the country's right to development. What do you think of the background of Chinese recent concretization and emphasis of 4 red lines? And what do you think of the possibility of conflict and compromise between U.S. and China for each red lines?
Well, that's not something new, actually. I think President Xi Jinping brought up the so-called 4 red lines during his meeting with President Biden in Bali back in November of 2022. So I mean, basically, we want to delineate the parameter in this relationship, in the interactions, what are negotiable, what are unnegotiable. Okay, so Biden responded by reassuring President Xi that the U.S. has no intention to support the Taiwan independence, no intention to change China's political system, no intention to, disrupt China's economic development, blah, 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 blah. Even though, in fact, he did everything, opposite to what he promised to President Xi. I think this is also a signal to the Trump administration about, the Chinese reliance, in dealing with the US. I think there will be, there has been, the fight in those areas, and this fight will continue in the years to come. But for the Biden administration, when it said it does not want to say conflict with China, we need some guardrail in this relationship. I think we should give some credit to it. But for the Trump administration, I'm not so sure, they are very aware of this kind of risk in, challenging the four red lines. So that's what I say when I use the word damage control in the next 4 years.
Yeah, in the Biden administration, the last year and a half or so. After the spy balloon situation where Blinken didn't cancel his trip to China, things looked really dire. At that point, there was a major effort by both sides to stabilize the relationship despite the strategic competition that was underway. So, and that's when the two sides spent a lot of time talking about principles, red lines, tried to get some better understanding of the perspective of one another in order to reduce the risk that this competition could spiral down into overt conflict. And I think that's what President Xi was really talking about.
Where to start? Very,
Yeah, so, when we try to respond to Chinese policy, we face a little bit of a problem that some Chinese policies are not honest. For example, Chinese official policy is that decoupling and de-risking are bad. China's official policy is that government shouldn't tell enterprises to de-risk, only enterprises should de-risk, et cetera, et cetera. But when we look at what China actually does, China has an enormous decoupling and de-risking policy driven by the government and carried out by the government through enterprises, even private enterprises, who have to listen to the government. So how do we put the relationship onto a more honest and forthcoming basis? If we're going to do this negotiation, avoid the bad outcomes, it seems to me we need a certain amount of, forthrightness about what people are actually doing. So how should we handle this?
Well, Barry, I think no government is 100% honest with its policy, right? So every government, you have to, tell the difference between their rhetoric and their policy behaviors. On this particular issue, I think China has to, accept the reality that the US is determined to decouple from the Chinese economy to some extent, no matter whether it uses the word decoupling or de-risking. That is going to happen. No matter it's a Republican government or Democratic government, that is going to happen. So we have to live with this reality and we have to accept it. And we may even have to, prepare for more of decoupling in the future. On the other hand, in the last 2 years, China has urged the US side, we need to sit down to talk about the securitization of economic relations. For understandable reasons, every country has its legitimate security concern about, conducting economic relations with other countries. However, there should be a limit to this securitization, and we should better sit down trying to delineate the boundary of securitization. I think that's what China has been pushing the US to do. And actually, in the last 2 years, when we established the joint group on trade and economic relations, discussion of securitization has been on the agenda. Has this led to any progress? Probably not. Probably not. So that leaves this task to the future government, whether we can continue to talk about this important topic, unless both sides have a decent understanding of the situation and the parameter, the boundary of securitization. I guess decoupling or de-risking will continue to proceed. That's my projection.
I agree, because both sides are implementing expensive policies to push decoupling. And China's been doing it since before Trump. But it accelerated in 2020 when Xi Jinping said, we need to have firm and controllable, we need safe and controllable supply chains.
Well, I think there's a major distinction between what China did and what the US did, starting with the Trump administration. What China did is that we should move up the value chain, and rather than stay at the low level of the value chain, we should become more competitive. However, if the US remains more advanced than China, China would be willing to buy the products, including the advanced chips from the US. We are not saying that no matter, even if the US are more advanced, we are not going to buy from the US. That's not the case. For the US, that is that in order to keep China inferior to the US, in order to keep China behind the US, we should decouple from China in certain areas of important, they call the key and emerging technologies. So I think this kind of decoupling is driven by different logic. For the first one, I think it's very normal. I mean, look at South Korea, look at Taiwan, they follow the same pattern. For the second one, that's a different story. That's a distinction.
So many questions. One more here, then the rest of them take them back. Go ahead.
So, thank you. So Susan and Professor Wu, Taiwan's come up with a couple of times. And the president-elect has basically said, I'm a nationalist, non-interventionist. I'm going to get peace in Russia. Peace in Russia, it's gotten, will mean a good portion of eastern Ukraine will go to Russia. Taiwan has the manufacturing of our most advanced chips. NVIDIA's chips are made at TSMC. That's a vulnerability. So do you see China using an opportunity if Trump does the things he says he's going to do, and yet he's a non-interventionist and doesn't want to intervene? Is there an opportunity for China to finally do something about Taiwan that they ultimately hope to get? What's your view on it?
Well, that would be a very extreme form of retaliation, and very risky to Xi Jinping himself. Because over the past 4 years in particular, the Biden administration has done a really impressive job of getting support from Japan, other Asian countries, but most particularly Japan. And there's also been improvement in Taiwan's capabilities. So for Xi to launch some kind of attack against Taiwan because of actions of the United States, not actions of Taiwan, is really risky, because if he is not successful, that could be cataclysmic to his future and the future of party rule in China. So he has to be sure that he will succeed. And if you just fired a bunch of your top generals because you believe they weren't telling you the truth about what kind of equipment, components were being used, and taking bribes in order to, in their acquisition processes and this kind of thing. He doesn't know if what the generals have been telling him is correct or not. So it's a very risky proposition to attack Taiwan, which is why all the experts I know in the United States who are experts on cross-strait relations, they don't believe that any kind of attack on Taiwan is imminent.
Yes.
Yeah, I think our approach to the Taiwan issue is not something tactical or opportunistic, but rather long-term, strategic, and patient. So as long as we believe the situation in the Taiwan Strait is under control, we are not in a hurry. Okay, so China has a very different strategic culture from, let's say, Russia, or even the United States. So not just because, US has a president like Donald Trump, then we would rush to get our job done on the Taiwan issue. I guess it's not the case. It's not the case. We have much broader national agenda to fulfill, and in which Taiwan is only one part of it. So I think it's still in the interest of both sides of the Taiwan Strait. Actually, also in the interest of US to seek a peaceful reunification. So let's try to, encourage all sides to work in that direction.
But I have to say that I've been disappointed that Beijing didn't make this commitment to peaceful reunification more credible over the past few years. They issued a white paper, left out a lot of the several of the commitments to Taiwan that they had made previously. There's no dialogue with Taiwan so long as it's a DPP government. So, that's what does, I don't anticipate any imminent attack on Taiwan. But I think it would be a lot wiser and more prudent for Beijing to also make this commitment to peaceful reunification more believable by the people of Taiwan and by Americans and other people too.
Well, so that you know this better than I do. In 1979, after the US switched diplomatic ties from Taipei to Beijing, and then China acted to reduce the military confrontation across the Taiwan Strait and officially promised to pursue a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. So, you know, in that context, the US played a very important role in encouraging China to adopt a peaceful approach to the
Right.
Taiwan issue. But in the last several years, the US was not helpful in this regard when it comes to the US Taiwan policy. So
They're
I
not,
also feel disappointed. Actually.
okay.
We are equally disappointed.
Thank you very much. What would you say to those that say the US is the country that create tension with China? For example, they might say that we are not, the Chinese might say that we are not the ones that support war criminals. We are not the ones that invade other countries. We are not the ones that carry out coups. We are just simply trying to build our infrastructure. We are the ones that try to help other countries to build their infrastructure. So what would be the argument for, or for example, human rights abuses? If we list the British and the American human rights abuses, China will be nothing compared to these two countries. So
Another
why
question for you.
point us in this regard?
Well, I don't find that very persuasive. But we can talk more about that later. I mean, America is not perfect. And that's pretty, I think we've been quite self-critical with good reason in recent years, but in terms of freedom of all sorts of freedoms. I mean, you can't possibly compare the situation in the United States with the situation in China. So, you know, I think most people in China would probably agree with that. But what's other than Xinjiang, however, you've noticed that human rights problems in China, which actually have gotten more serious with the more repressive type role of the internal security police and censorship and everything. And yet it hasn't really been very prominent in US policy over the past two administrations. Or even in Europe. It's really all there's a lot more focus on Xinjiang, a little bit on Tibet. But the lack of rule of law and other human rights issues somehow seem to have not gotten a lot of attention.
Almost the time we have to leave, hard constraint. But maybe
Allow some students.
we'll
Yeah,
ask a student question. One more question. If you can keep it short, it would be very welcome.
I agree with the point that the Trump presidency might be an opportune moment for this kind of bargain or strategy consultation between the US and China, and we already had similar experience in the 1970s. So there are some interesting parallels between the Nixon administration and the Trump administration, because America is in relative decline, domestic economic crisis and war fatigue, and two maverick presidents wants to downsize American commitments to allies and partners. So if Trump administration approaches to China and tries to make a grand bargain with Chinese leaders, is China ready to accept that deal? Or what is the position of China?
I think we are open to all kinds of proposals from the Trump administration that are reasonable, constructive, and mutually beneficial. Is this too diplomatic?
Yeah. Unfortunately.
We just need more graduates,
Oh.
graduates from USD to work in the Trump team.
Unfortunately, we really are at the end now. So I think we've had a wonderful discussion, it's extremely thought provoking, and I hope you take your thoughts home and continue to communicate about them. And maybe we can have more dialogues like this in the future. This is the last talk, as I mentioned, for this quarter. We'll have an exciting lineup next quarter. The first one will be on, pretty big public event will be on January 16th with Professor Martin White from Harvard and George Washington University and Scott Rozelle from Stanford University. But then there'll be many others. Please make sure to look at our website and newsletters and keep in touch. In the meantime, have a wonderful holiday.
Thank you.